Good afternoon, students. Today is January 13th on this lovely Friday afternoon. Today we'll be going over Supreme Court and justice, and you will even have your own opportunity to become a Supreme Court justice and be assigned a Supreme Court case to establish your own opinions about the case. Let's get started. Today's standards, PA standards that are connected to today's lesson would be standard 5.1cc. Evaluate the application of the principles and ideas in contemporary civil life, such as liberty, freedom, democracy, justice, and equality, which will be discussed more. Justice and how justice plays a role in our democracy. Standard 5.3cf. Explain the Supreme Court's role in interpreting the U.S. Constitution, such as individual states and civil rights will be more focused on our Socratic seminar, You Are the Justice. The lesson objectives of today. You will be able to simulate the process of interpreting the facts and law, deliberation, and developing opinions in a Supreme Court case. You will be able to retell in your own words how justice plays a vital role in equal justice under law. Today's agenda, first things first, our after bell activity, our Padlet. At the end of the lesson, you will be given access to the Google Slides of today's lesson. The Socratic seminar, You Are the Justice, the rubric to the Socratic seminar, and at the end of class, you will be required to complete an exit ticket. And you will be given a graphic organizer for the Socratic seminar if you need it. Let's get started with our Padlet. In your own words, what does equal justice under law mean? Students will be able to have access to this Padlet by clicking on the plus sign, which then turns into a writing utensil, and be able to type or even use images to express what equal justice under law means to them. And this will be about 5 minutes of class time, as students will be able to have the opportunity to elaborate more on their answer to equal justice under law means to them. So, under justice, equal justice under law is actually inscribed into the main entrance of the Supreme Court building. As you're walking up the stairs to the Supreme Court building, you will see right in front of you, equal justice under law, and every justice has to walk up those stairs and see that quote inscribed above where they work, as that is part of their oath as a justice, being able to provide all citizens equal justice within the U.S. Constitution. So let's look at some key terms. Some key terms are, what is a justice? A justice is a judge or magistrate of the Supreme or state court. Supreme Court is the highest court in the United States. Deliberation is a long, careful discussion. Conjuring opinion means in agreement of the majority opinion, and dissenting opinion means in disagreement of the majority opinion. And both conjuring opinion and dissenting opinion are in the court system. Let's go into our introduction. As we discussed before, the Supreme Court is the highest court of the United States. The responsibility of our Supreme Court is to ensure all U.S. citizens defined under our U.S. Constitution are promised equal justice under law. Justices are the guardians and interpreters of the U.S. Constitution, which we can give thanks to Chief Justice John Marshall, which we will discuss later on in today's lesson. What does it mean to be a guardian and interpreter of the U.S. Constitution? Students will be allowed to express what a guardian means, what they think a guardian of the U.S. Constitution looks like, what does an interpreter of the U.S. Constitution, as again, this is what the role of a justice is in the Supreme Court. A brief history is the U.S. Constitution established the court, but did not explain the exact powers or organization of it. As of where we look back in history, the Virginia and New Jersey plan they wanted to really define how Congress is going to be organized and what powers a Congress can have, a balance between Congress and the president, as our framers were more focused on what does government look like and weren't exactly focused on what the Supreme Court would look like. So Congress decided in 1789 they would be passing the Judiciary Act. Essentially, there will be 13 judiciary districts in 3 circuits: Eastern, Middle, and Southern. As of that, during that time, we only had the eastern part of the United States that people were living in. The Supreme Court would be established as the highest judicial tribunal located in the nation's capital. During that time, that would be New York City, as it had just moved from Philadelphia. There would be 1 Chief Justice and 5 Associate Justices. February 1st, in 1790, the first assembly of the Supreme Court happened at Merchants Exchange Building in New York City. Ironically enough, it had to be postponed a day due to transportation issues that all the justices were facing. The first justice was John Jay. An important case that was first heard was West versus Barnes, and this was the first official Supreme Court back in August 3rd, 1791. Another important figure is the appointment of Chief Justice John Marshall, as he would have a lasting effect on the court with his vigorous and able leadership. He is best known for establishing the powers of the judicial department so that it can be equal to Congress and the executive branches of government, as we start to look at the defining separation of powers. He was also played a major role in interpreting the Constitution in a way that would increase the federal government, as he was a Federalist during this time, so he believed that the federal government should have more power that is currently defined in our U.S. Constitution, and prior to that, the Articles of Confederation, which, as we know, was rewritten into the U.S. Constitution. So let's get into the justices of the Supreme Court in today's world. On the front row here, we have Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor. Next to her is Associate Justice Clarence Thomas. Next to him is our Chief Justice John J. Roberts Jr. And next besides him is Associate Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr. And besides him is Associate Justice Elena Kagan. In the back row, we have Amy Coney Barrett, who was appointed by former President Donald Trump back in 2021. And then we have Associate Justice Neil M. Gorsuch. Besides him is Associate Justice Brett M. Kavanaugh. And finally, Associate Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who was appointed back in 2022 by our current president, Joe Biden. So let's get into information on justices and what their job looks like, and even their salary. So prior to 1869, the number of justices changed at least 6 times. And it was finally decided that there should be a total of 9 Supreme Court justices to oversee cases that are brought up to the Supreme Court. In order to become a justice, the President of the United States must have appointed justices, and then the Senate approves the justice. As we talked about, on average, a new justice joins the court about every 2 years due to retirement or the passing of the justice, as justices are to serve for life, which is called good behavior. The reason behind the good behavior clause is that so that justices aren't easily influenced by public opinion like politicians are, as politicians rely solely on the people voting them in to keep running for terms in office, and of course certain political positions are term limited as well. Justices are the only exception to this rule. Their salaries are to remain the same while in office, so they have a set salary, and that is their salary for as long as they are in office. The way they're seated on the bench is by seniority, and since 1800, justices have always worn black robes. At the beginning of a private conferences as to deliberate on cases that are been appointed to the Supreme Court, as there is a process for which not the Supreme Court doesn't see every single case that is brought to the Supreme Court appointment as they are deciding on which cases to take. They have a handshake where they shake hands with one another, and it's called the judicial handshake. Now let's get into our Socratic seminar. You will have 60 minutes to complete the Socratic seminar, and you will need to discuss the assigned case within your group of 8 peers. You will need to write your conjuring or dissenting opinions about the case. So now we're going to get into discussing what this Socratic seminar looks like. As I thought, a best way for students to be able to understand the role of our Supreme Court justice is to become one. So they would be with 8 other classmates, and this would be a mixed group of students with abilities, as I have a mixed case of advanced, proficient, and not proficient students in my class. And I want to be able to pair students who will help their non-proficient students in understanding the material here. And there's a lot of research into how peer tutoring really does help peers feel more comfortable with their academic needs and being able to be more open to asking for help if they need be as well. So one person would be the Chief Justice, and the role of the Chief Justice would be to kind of just go over the case and kind of give the majority opinion on the case. And then all the others would be Associate Justice. Afterwards, they will read, so once they decide who's the Chief Justice, they will be reading through the case and then begin deliberation on the case. Once the deliberation is finished, voting would take place. And at the end of each voting, so I will have a poll in each breakout room for the students to vote on agree or disagree with the majority opinion of the Supreme Court has decided in that case. And then they will write an opinion while citing evidence in the case as to why or why not they agree, or conjuring or dissenting opinion about the case. So I have essentially 4 groups of students at max. And the Supreme Court cases that I decided the students should be looking into will be relevant to them as they are students, as each case is involving a school or school district in individual rights. We got Brown versus Board of Education, Engel versus Vitale, Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District, Hazelwood School District versus Colmar. As we know, Brown versus Board of Education is a landmark in deciding separate but not equal does not mean equal educational opportunities. Englewood versus Vitale is should prayers in school be allowed, as this is even still today's debate. Tinker versus Des Moines Independent Community School District is essentially, and this is just to kind of go over what the students will be looking at, is essentially does prohibition against the wearing of armbands in political school as a form of symbolic speech violate students' freedom of speech protection guaranteed by the First Amendment. So kind of talking a little bit about how students were wearing armbands in protest of the Vietnam War, as there was a lot of dissent about going into the war in Vietnam. And finally, talking about the Hazel School District versus Colmar. And again, the issue with this is the fact that is a student newspaper a public forum? Does Principal Rayner's removal of portions of the Hazelwood East High School student newspaper violate the students' First Amendment rights? And essentially, I will be grading the students on this rubric. in 4 categories. Conduct, which is basically, are they asking for clarification from others, bringing others into the conversation, moving the conversation forward, speaking to all participants, and avoid talking too much. Also being appropriate and showing following school expectations and interaction with peers. Speaking and reasoning, are they able to really understand before answering questions and cite evidence from the case in expressing thoughts in completed sentences? Listening, are they able to pay attention to detail and response and being able to listen before responding to their peers? And finally, barely familiar with the text and has really understood the reading, as I will be able to add additional support to my students who have reading comprehension goals in their IEPs, as I will be placing them in a group together as I'm being more mindful with my group. So I will have one group of students who are needed extra time. So I will be hopping into that group more than the other groups, as this is my students who need more time to be able to understand the assignment that is given to them. And once they all come back, they'll have a brief discussion. The Chief Justice of each group would come forward, talk a little bit, give a brief overview of the case and what the majority opinion was, and explain why. And then finally, the students will be given exit tickets to complete before they can leave class. So I have 2 different Google Forms for them to complete. This Google form is for my advanced and proficient students. What new information did I learn from today's lesson? What surprised me most about what I learned? Identify if my opinion was concurring or dissenting from my peers in the Socratic seminar portion of the lesson, and essentially summarize what you learned today. The second ticket would be for my non-proficient students and really more targeted towards my students with reading comprehension goals to be able to assess what they understood about today's lesson and through the reading as well in the Socratic seminar. Define a justice, define a Supreme Court, define deliberation, define concurring opinions, define dissenting opinion. How does the U.S. Constitution define the Supreme Court? Justices are to serve for life, which is called blank. This is the fill in the blank. How many Supreme Court justices are there? Who is the newly appointed justice? And list one interesting fact you learned about today, just so that I can really get an understanding on what stick with them and what they found interesting and what I really need to review over with these students who are struggling to understand today's lesson. And of course, during the Socratic seminar, students will be given a graphic organizer for those that really need it, especially my students with reading comprehension goals, as this will be able for them to easily organize their thoughts onto paper before really formulating their own opinion about their case that they are assigned to. This kind of concludes today's lesson that I went over. I really look forward to hearing back from you, so thank you for taking the time to watch this lesson.